So hi all, I'm Abhinav and I head India and Middle East for CanAm. And now we are going to talk about the procedures and subscription procedure and timeline, how to choose a regional center and project, and how to avoid common pitfalls. EB5, simply put, is investing capital and creating American jobs. And Ron, would you like to share how this program was started, the intent behind it, the investment amount, etc.?
Sure. So very briefly, the history of this is that there was really no good program to invest and get a green card until 1990. And all the various attempts that Congress made to have an investment green card program failed because someone would stand up in the US Congress and say, we're not going to let people buy their way into America. And through a very interesting series of events, they changed the concept of an investment green card to an employment creation green card. And instead of saying if you invest money in a business in the US, you're going to get a green card if it creates jobs, they say if you create jobs by an investment, you're going to get a green card. Who could be opposed to employment creation immigration? And that's ultimately how it ended up passing in 1990. When the EB5 program started, it was only the direct EB5 program. It wasn't until the early 1990s that Congress said, well, you know, it's nice to start a business and have 10 jobs, but we can really use this program to have major, you know, infrastructure, construction projects, real estate development projects, where 100 or 200 investors can pool their investments and really have EB5 be part of the capital stack of major developments. And that was in the early 90s, and the Regional Center program, with some fits and starts, has grown since then. And honestly, for a while, it was a pretty unsuccessful program. That had its own problems, but I'd say starting about 7, 8 years ago maybe, it became a very popular program for a whole variety of reasons. And now the program is suffering from its popularity. It has too much popularity because only 10,000 people, a small percentage of the total green cards, can get their green cards through EB5. And that's not 10,000 investors, that's 10,000 people. So if it's an average family of 3, that's about 3,000 investors per year. And with the great demand for EB5, that's the reason we now have backlogs and in quotas for a number of countries, not yet including India, but likely in the future creating India. So the challenge has gone from the fact that we had an unpopular program to the fact that we have a too popular program, and trying to work with Congress to add numbers to the program to avoid the situation of people who are willing to invest money in the US, create jobs in the US, but have to wait long periods of time in order to immigrate to the US.
Right. So Mark, investment amount is $500,000 or $1 million. As an attorney, what do you have to look into before an investor can invest their capital?
Well, the first thing is you have to make sure that the capital is usable for EB5 purposes, which means that you have to show where it came from and how it was made. So this frequently comes up. We frequently have a client from India who says, I earned all this money as salary. It's true, they did earn the money as salary and they went into a bank account, but then it went into investment X, Y, and Z, and it's been all over the place through the DMAT account, et cetera, et cetera. So it just takes time to sort of pull that all together. So what we usually do with a client these days from India is we sort of offer a very limited engagement to do source of funds first, just to kind of make sure that you're clear and ahead. And the second thing is you need to make sure that you can get the money out of India, if the money's coming from India, which is increasingly a problem. If people want to talk about that, I can. I know I'm in Silicon Valley, so people may have their money here, but the Reserve Bank of India has made that quite complex, and it's not as simple as 2.5 lakh US dollars per Indian financial year. There's rules against clubbing and different things, so we have to make sure you can do that, and we don't want to violate Indian law, which is why we have Indian lawyer on staff. Does that answer your question, Abby?
Yes. So I guess to summarize, not only do the source of funds need to be well documented, the money has to be legal, and also it should be legally remitted from whatever country it's being sent from to the United States. Just can funds earned within the United States be used for EB5?
Absolutely. There's a misconception sometimes. People will come and say, oh, I would do EB5, but I can't because all my money's in America. There's no requirement that the funds be coming from outside the country. It has to be your money. That's basically what it is.
Okay. Ron, so let's say I have $500,000 and I wish to invest in a regional center. As an attorney, what do you look into while recommending or assisting clients with making an informed decision with respect to a regional center?
Yeah, so there's two major issues that people have to be thinking about when they're deciding where to invest. You know, number one is what is going to be best for to meet my immigration goals of both getting my green card, which is a 2-year green card, and then after that getting my permanent green card. So that's number one, and it's critical that somebody, if you're our client, it's us, will be doing immigration due diligence on a project. We have projects that we keep track of that we think, regional centers and projects, that we think from our immigration due diligence have a very high chance of achieving the immigration goals. That's half of the issue. Often it's the most important half of the issue, but that's half of the issue. The second part of the issue is the financial part, which is if you invest in your money and you're going to get a green card and you're happy, but you're not really happy if you lose all your money. So, we try to encourage our clients to get completely independent evaluations of the financial aspects of the project. What's the exit strategy? What's the chances this project is going to be successful or unsuccessful? What's the chances you're going to get your money back? So those are the two parts. On the immigration due diligence side, I don't know how much detail we want to go into. If we want to, Abhi, I'm happy to, but we do post on our website a list that we call investor due diligence set of questions that we give to all of our investor clients, which goes through the kinds of things that we are looking at, that you, my clients, should be looking at when you're choosing a regional center and a project.
Got it. Ron, do you have a preference for real estate, infra, franchise model projects? Do you have a preference there?
Well, I would say a disproportionate amount of the projects that our investors go into are real estate development projects of one sort or another. And one of the reasons for that is that the ability to have large numbers of jobs accepted by the Immigration Service, what's called indirect and induced jobs. The easiest way to do that is through construction jobs. So these are not W-2 employees. These are economic methodologies that the U.S. government accepts for urban planning purposes, for immigration and other purposes, that says if you're spending X amount of hard construction costs on something, and X amount of soft construction, and it's in this location, and it's this construction timeline, you put all that together and that's going to produce 987 jobs. And that means we can have up to 98 investors in that project. So it's easiest to do that in ways acceptable to the Immigration Service in real estate development projects. So our experience is more with that than with other things. Certainly EB5 has been used successfully in some infrastructure projects, less so in kind of manufacturing projects and that kind of thing. But that's how I would answer that, Abhi.
Got it. Mark, an investor has the money now. You've done your due diligence on source of funds. Investor has selected the project. What's next? What's the process? What's the timeline?
Well, you said that the investor's done the due diligence on we've done the due diligence on the source of funds. They've done due diligence on the regional center. You know, just a couple of sort of emphasis points. One, you got to look at the regional center staff. We have a list of questions too, but please do, because as Ron just said, a lot of these projects are quite complex real estate finance projects, and some of the new regional centers in the business have no business in being a regional center, in my opinion, in that sort of realm. So do look at the regional center. And then assuming you've looked at the project too, and then the other side is getting your money back. If you were a domestic investor, you would not just do a financial analysis. You'd have a lending lawyer. So I say there are issues in some of those projects that no financial analyst is going to pick up because it'd be practicing law without a license to do it. So I would suggest also looking at that. But assuming that's cleared and you've chosen what you think for you is the lowest risk project in the market, the next step is that you would remit the funds to the regional center through an appropriate mechanism, and then you will have proof of investment. Armed with your proof of investment, the law firm that you hire will then file Form I-526. Form I-526, if you look at the US government's website, they'll tell you the national average is 2 to 3 years on that processing time. On a Form I-526 at the moment, we see recently some projects come in at sort of 8 months, less than that. Generally, somebody who comes to you and says, invest in us, it's going to be faster, is someone you probably don't want to be talking to. But it is true that some of them process faster than those national averaging times. So then at some point you'll get your I-526 form approved, and then it depends where you are. If you are resident in the United States, you'll then proceed to adjustment to status, which has a processing time around about a year. At the moment, depending where it's filed, depending on different things. If you're not in the United States and you do consular processing, and that has its own sort of bits and bobs to it. But I think most people are here, so let's talk about adjustment to status. You'll then find yourself on a conditional green card status. That conditional green card lasts for 2 years, 90 days before the end of that 2-year period. Your lawyer will file Form I-829 to have the conditions on that removed. Once the conditions are removed, you'll find yourself in full green card. I don't like the use of the term conditional green card because people begin to think, well, my conditional green card has different rights and privileges to a full green card. So sometimes perhaps the word temporary green card, you get 2 years and then you have to have it affirmed, is perhaps more helpful. So you'll have the I-829 approved, you have a full green card. The next step, you're sort of into 4 years into green cards, give or take a little bit at that point. The next thing that you're thinking about is naturalization as a US citizen. After 5 years after you obtain that first conditional temporary green card, you would be eligible for that if you meet the other requirements, which you can talk about in more detail if you want to. And then simultaneously to that, once that's achieved, for our Indian clients, we suggest that they seriously look at obtaining an OCI card at that time. The return of the capital, people get confused between that and the immigration process. Return of the capital is governed by the investment agreements that you enter into with the regional center. From an immigration perspective, it's now clear that you can get that, well, according to the department's current policy, you can get that back after you've filed the I-829, but that's not really the relevant time for most people. You'll be looking at the contracts that you entered into with the regional center. And that's a whole topic of due diligence around itself to make sure that, that there aren't some foolhardy provisions in that. So, yeah.
Can I just add we kind of, we talked about due diligence. I think it's important to note there's a great amount of due diligence that Mitch and I and other good immigration attorneys do on a project to see if we think it's going to qualify. Now, once you have a project that qualifies, we're not really doing as much due diligence on the regional center, but the regional center becomes a critical part of that. So you can have a wonderful, perfect project, and if it's sponsored by the wrong regional center, all sorts of things can go wrong, and we've seen this. So with the regional center, number one issue is this is going to be a multiple year process. This is going to be at a minimum a 5 or more year process, and in many cases longer than that. So this may seem like not a big deal, but it is a big deal. So number one is the regional center has to be in existence throughout this entire project. And I say that because there have been hundreds of regional centers smaller regional centers with not much activity, not much infrastructure, that end up getting terminated every year. So in addition to having the right project, we have to have a regional center that's both here today and is going to be here tomorrow. Number two is where we've seen things go wrong very often is with projects that with due diligence everything looks fine. I've been involved, there's been a very high profile project in Vermont, sponsored by the state of Vermont, where it's called JPEAK, and we're now representing the SEC receiver in that project. If you do your due diligence, everything was fine with the project. But then what happens for the next 5 years? Who's watching over your money and the project? And you want to have a regional center that you know is going to be doing that, what we call ongoing compliance, ongoing monitoring and review of the status of the project and of your money. Because in order to get your permanent green card, every step of the way has to be traced and tracked in meticulous detail. And that's the regional center's responsibility. So there's really two levels of due diligence. One is choosing the right project. You're investing in a project, not a regional center. But two is the regional center is critical to your ultimate success.
I mean, just to emphasize on that too. He says, they're going to. I mean, a regional center is not an asset manager, but it functions very much like an asset manager in EB5. So they are going to manage, the documents say the regional center will be making certain decisions on your behalf in certain scenarios. So not only are they going to do that, you want to make sure they're competent to do that. That's something on that due diligence side too. Look at the backgrounds of the people in the regional center, see what they've done before. Someone who was running a duck farm for 5 years and decides to get into real estate finance might not be the person you want effectively acting as your asset manager.
Thanks, Mark. Ron, Mark mentioned it's a multi-stage process. Starts with application for conditional green card, consular interview, removal of conditions. What are the different things that USCIS is looking at these stages, different stages?
Sure. So at the I-526, the EB-5 petition stage, the Immigration Service is really focusing on two main things. One is the lawful source of your funds. And that's, Mark has mentioned it, I'm just going to emphasize it. That's not like a macro issue of saying, well, look, I'm a successful entrepreneur, I've started businesses, therefore, obviously, my funds are legal. That's, sometimes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of paper showing exactly how you made your money at different times and the flow of the money, how it got from there to you to the project. That's one thing they're looking at the I-526 stage, and the other is the project. Our due diligence list of issues on projects is 4 pages. That's what we got. We put together a lot of projects. We're the attorney for a lot of new projects. And there's an awful lot of things that could go wrong that we make sure don't go wrong. But the Immigration Service is then going to evaluate all the details about the project before they approve the EB-5 petition. So that's what happens at stage 1, the I-526 petition. As Mark said, when the 526 is approved, if you're in the United States, you're applying for adjustment of status in the U.S. And if you're out of the U.S., you're filing what's called a DS-260, immigrant visa application, you and your family at the U.S. consulate. Now, as a general rule, they're not looking at EB-5 issues. EB-5 has already been approved. What they're looking at is whether there's anything about you personally that makes you inadmissible to the U.S. Do you have what's called medical grounds of exclusion? Do you have a criminal background? Have you lied about anything at any point of the immigration process? There's a long list of about 40 things that you will hopefully be answering no to, but if the answer is yes to any of them, we need to see if you're admissible to the U.S. Nothing to do with EB-5, just having to do with you personally. All right? You get through that process, you now get your 2-year conditional green card. At the end of the 2 years, 21 to 24 months after you get your conditional green card, you file the I-829 condition removal petition. Now, there are 2 issues that the Immigration Service looks at on that. Number one, have you sustained your investment? Have you gotten your money back? The answer can't be yes. The answer must be that you have not gotten your money back, at least until the end of the 2-year conditional residence period. And the biggest issue that comes up at the I-829 stage is job creation. So at the I-526 stage, they're approving your EB-5 petition based on a projection of jobs that will be created. At the I-829 stage, the rubber hits the road. Did you, in fact, create those jobs? Now, on most regional center projects, that's not a matter of saying, here's Joe and here's Jim, and they're both employed. It's showing that when our business plan on the I-526 said we're going to build a hotel, and we're going to spend $80 million in building this hotel of hard construction costs, and $30 million of soft construction costs, and everything, and it's going to take 2 years and 8 months to build this. They're going to now look at the 829 stage and figure out, were your projections correct? And even if they weren't correct, were there at least the necessary number of jobs created? That's the biggest issue at the I-829 stage, is job creation. And it's very important that there's no surprises in this. So we, with regional centers that we work with, we want to make sure that on an ongoing basis, they're auditing the job creation, the expenditures, so that there's no surprises at the time of the I-829 filing. So that's the focal points at each stage of the process, Abhi.
Thank you. Mark, we've seen that Indian investors gravitate towards making a direct investment, that is starting their own business. What are the things that they need to be careful about? What's the ground reality? Can you shed some light on that?
Sure. So I would say that almost, not quite, but almost every investor we have come to us that says that they want to do a direct investment, after you really talk through that, they change their mind and they do a regional center case. And there are several reasons for that. One, we talked about earlier, each investor has to create 10 jobs. One of the advantages of being a regional center is you get to use an economic model. Now I'm going to vastly simplify it at the risk of making a mistake, but essentially think of an economic model in this context as like a black box. You put some money, some dollars into it, and the machine says that you create X number of jobs. The jobs aren't sort of really there. Gross simplification, but essentially that's what it is. If you're direct, you have direct employees in the business. You can't do that. If I have my factory, I must have 10 employees. And when you begin to count up the costs of running 10 employees, doesn't necessarily make economic sense. Furthermore, as I said earlier, those jobs have to be real jobs. They can't be jobs that you're just keeping someone on the payroll, because immigration will look. They have tables, they have charts, they'll look at industry averages, and they'll say, you don't really need 10 employees, do you? So job count would be sort of a major reason. And then I think risk. We talked earlier, if you look at the way that some of these regional center projects are structured, you have to have risk to have to EB5 or you're not getting a green card. But some of those projects, the way they're structured, if I was representing Goldman Sachs, or I represented for many years, I'd be saying that I don't have a concern with this project. So risk, I think, is another thing to think about when you're thinking about direct. There's inherently more risk. You're often talking about an operating business. So we have, a real story, a very unfortunate story that perhaps illustrates this. We have a client from Mumbai, and they had a cousin who was opening a factory in the state of Mississippi. He's going to employ 30 people. He's got all kinds of tax credits from the state. Everything looks great. And we advised them up front, think regional center, but the cousin, his dad in Mumbai sold everything he had for his son to give him $500,000 so he could do this. So he invests in the cousin's factory. Everything looks technically correct. However, there was a change in the market and the business failed. So unfortunately, they lost their money and they didn't get a green card. And that's nothing to do with bad immigration filing or any such thing. It's just that there wasn't a demand for the products and the business failed. So, think about it. You're getting into a business, there's often operational risk, a lot of operational risk with those direct cases.
Yeah, I agree. We tell our clients that if the main motivation is to get a green card, then regional center is probably the best option. If you are motivated to be involved in business in the US, and by the way, also get a green card, then direct EB-5 makes sense. It doesn't usually make sense to say, well, I didn't really want to be in business, but I want to get a green card, therefore I'll do direct EB-5. So it makes sense for some, it doesn't make sense for, I'd say, most of our clients.
Big red flag, just the sort of it is families. Indians don't like risk. So they say, well, I don't know these regional center guys, like I don't trust these, etc. But I do trust my cousin who's opening a little hotel in the middle of nowhere. Well, your cousin may be a very honest guy, and he may be very straightforward, and you may be able to trust him, but it doesn't mean his business won't fail. It doesn't mean that, you know, a massive office building in New York isn't structured so the chances of you losing your money is very, very low indeed.
Great. So what are the common pitfalls in general, Ron, with regional center EB-5s? Where do you see things go wrong?
Sure. I would say the biggest issue we see is simply that the project isn't structured right. There are very, very detailed immigration requirements. So we've talked a lot about the project. We've talked a lot about the regional center. I think it's important also to talk about the professional team behind it. So is there a securities lawyer who structured the offering document and the escrow agreement and the private placement memorandum and the subscription agreement in a way that's compliant with the specific EB-5 rules? There are so many things that can go wrong that an experienced EB-5 securities attorney will make sure it doesn't go wrong. Is the economist an experienced EB-5 economist? This is very much a cottage industry. Is there someone doing the business plan that's an experienced business plan writer? An EB-5 business plan has totally different criteria than any business plan for any other reason in the country or the world. And lastly, is there an immigration lawyer involved who is an experienced, not an experienced immigration lawyer, but an experienced EB-5 lawyer who knows, you know, what the immigration service is looking at? And the interesting thing about this is that so much of what we deal with, you can't find anywhere in the law. It's what the immigration service policy is at any given time. So we live and die with what's called stakeholders meetings and policy manuals and different things where the law never changes, but how they view cases changes. If we get something called a request for evidence on a case where they have some problems with it because of something, all of our people know about that because, you know, whether it's the law or not, they're starting to look at something. So all of these things are important to, you know, all of those professionals need to be lined up to know what the immigration service policy is and to be able to structure a project that is compliant with the latest policies of the immigration service.
Thanks. And Mark, looks like clients rely heavily on attorneys to make the right choice. So, you know, there have been cases of attorneys getting compensated by regional centers for sending clients. What do you think about that and importance of independent attorneys?
Well, I think it's very important, obviously it's very important to be independent. If anyone's conducting some kind of due diligence on anything and they have some kind of financial relationship with the subject entity, they're not really free to give you a true independent advice. So I think the instances where lawyers are actually getting paid by the regional centers are much less common than perhaps they were in the past. But what isn't so uncommon is seeing an instance where you may have a lawyer who drafted the documents, they set up the project for the regional center. You're now hiring that lawyer to review those documents and to criticize them and tell you where the risks are. So it really is in my mind, not the industry, but in my mind, that's a conflict of interest. You don't hire someone to review their own work product. So, you know, Abby's asking, you know, the first question is, it used to be the case that lawyers got paid. for referral. So if you came to me and I said, oh, the guys at CanAm are great, and you went to CanAm, I'd have gotten some money. My firm never did that. We've never taken a dollar from anybody, but in the past, people have done, and the US authorities are coming down on that quite hard now. But I think the more subtle thing is, is your advisor truly independent? So we have a list of 60 questions to ask regional centers and some to ask lawyers. One of the questions is, have you ever received any financial compensation from that regional center ever? Because it might be that it's not relevant, but you might want to know about that. You might want to know if they've been paid to write some of the documents in that project, because they're criticizing their own work. What happens if something goes wrong? We have cases too where they go wrong. If I am on the payroll of the regional center, if they're my client, and something goes wrong, it may influence my attitude to how aggressive I am representing my investors. So I do think that the point Abby's making is one to be thought about.
There's another aspect, Mark, to the independence and conflict issue, and that is in many of these transactions, there's a regional center. In many cases, you invest money in what is, in effect, a lending company that lends money to the developer building the project. And in some cases, they're all the same. The regional center and the lender and the borrower are the same entity. And there's, needless to say, inherent potentials for conflict there. There's nothing illegal about it. But I'm not sure that would be my first choice of investment. I would want to make sure there's independent parties throughout this transaction. So in addition to what Mark said, having to do with the lawyer, I think there's also important independence and conflict issues having to do with the parties to the transaction.
That's true, because remember, these regional centers are making decisions. So if something goes wrong, it's probably the regional center who's making the decision of, I'm going to foreclose on the property, and none of that happens frequently, or I'm going to take action against the developer. If the guy building the building, the developer, and the regional center are the same person, they're hardly likely to sue themselves.
Ron, failure and frauds are not a stranger to this industry. If something goes south, what remedies do investors have?
Yeah. As I've mentioned, this is an unfortunate growth industry for us. There are only a handful, 2 or 3 law firms that get brought in when projects go bad. And we are one of them. They call us the firemen of the EB-5 industry. Now, it's important to understand that there are 2 different things you're concerned about when a project goes bad. Number 1, are you going to get your green card? And number 2, are you going to get your money back? So for example, let's say there's no fraud. It's just the project's going bankrupt. You aren't going to get your money back, but you may get your green card. Because as long as you don't get your money back, the investment has been sustained. By definition, you haven't gotten it back. And if the building was built before it went bankrupt, the jobs have been created. So for a lot of investors in projects that go bad, even if they may not be able to get their money back, they may be able to get their green card. In the J. Peak project I mentioned, we have a wonderful SEC-appointed receiver. And we had a project where nothing ever happened. Nothing was built. And close to 100 investors basically were out of luck. No jobs, no money. And we've designed something that we think is going to get every single investor his green card and his money back. Because the receiver sued various parties who were responsible for the fraud, was able to collect money from all of those third parties, and we are now doing what's called redeploying the money into another project that's going to create jobs. And in the end, we hope that even in a totally fraudulent, totally failed project, we're going to be able to get people their green cards and their money back. So unfortunately, there's fraud, and unfortunately, that's all you read about. My main office is in Philadelphia, and this is unsolicited, but half of Philadelphia was built by CanAm projects. There's hotels, there's a convention center, there's the Comcast Center, all this stuff, and it's like a poster child for EB-5. Well, there's no stories about that. However, if 1 out of 100 projects go bad somewhere, there's stories everywhere about that. So is there fraud in the EB-5 program? Yes. Are there failed projects? Yes. Are a huge percentage of the projects non-fraudulent and successful? Yes, that's also true. You just don't read about them.
Thanks. I'm going to open up the floor for questions now. Please use the mic.
I'm just wondering, can you give some estimate of what the cost is besides the $500,000 for all these pieces that one has to put together in terms of having immigrations in various countries, et cetera? Just ballpark.
There's different pieces. There's fees you have to pay to the United States government. Then there's attorney fees. And then there's every regional center charges an administrative fee.
Okay.
So the administrative fees can vary significantly. The one thing I'd caution on is we have clients who don't value seem not to value regional centers because they say, I want zero fee or cheap fee. Just remember those guys are looking after your money,
sure.
and they're really doing a serious job. So I think you want to think very carefully about that. On the government side fees, if you take the entire process with everything, a budget of around about $10,000 is right. The cost of filing Form I-526 is $3,675. Then you have an I-829 fee. Then you have fees for adjustment of status or consular processing. So roughly around about, but remember, this process lasts a long time, so some of those fees may escalate.
Sure.
On the lawyers' center side, those fees can vary. I can tell you what my firm charges, but I've seen as low as sort of $12,000 to $15,000. Then you have to figure what's really someone doing for that. They might just be filling in your forms and filing them and really not doing any due diligence that Ron was talking about or anything else. Through to, I think the most expensive I've seen was $50,000 or $60,000 for the process. Okay. But most people seem to be sort of, in the middle of that somewhere.
And regional center.
Yeah, ballpark.
Ranges?
You're looking at a total of, including attorney fees, government fees, around 80 to 90K over and above.
Okay.
500,000.
Okay.
Admin fees range around the 50,000 mark. I mean, they can be around 40, 60, but they average around $50,000 over and above your $500,000 investment.
Okay, so really if one is pursuing this, now with direct, I assume the regional center fee would go away, but the rest of it would still be there?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And one little footnote is there are some expenses baked into the regional center fee that you have to pay if you're on direct. So for example, you need a business plan. Doing a good EB-5 business plan, really you need to know what you're doing, as Ron mentioned. Regional center kind of takes care of that for you. So that's sort of in their fee, really.
And corporate attorneys and employment attorneys that you'll be using for your direct investments for your company. So it all comes down to almost the same. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question. I'm looking at EB-5 more for my son. It's the category, one of the categories indicated where he is actually working here under STEM OPT. Now, the question I have is that if he applies for the EB-5, and obviously there's a time involved and there's an uncertainty involved in the process. And in the meanwhile, if he has opportunities to apply for H-1B, is it okay from a legal angle to have kind of two parallel applications? And second, is it advisable, or you should just shut the H-1B option off and just wait for the EB-5?
It's definitely perfectly fine to have multiple applications going at the same time. You can have an H-1B petition, you can have an EB-2, you can have an EB-5. And not only is it perfectly okay, it's fairly normal.
Okay.
Many of the EB-5s for our Indian clients are people who are already in the EB-2 line. Should you do, your STEM OPT, depending on when you start the EB-5 process, you may be able to get the EB-5 petition approved and the I-485 filed before the OPT runs out. But the good news is that the EB-5 petition, if you filed it, and if your STEM OPT is running out, there's absolutely no negative in terms of your ability to get an H-1B. So we always tell people to be prepared for the need to do an H-1B. And if you can avoid it because you started EB-5 quickly enough, that's great. If not, you should be able to get the H-1B, and then eventually you'll be able to complete the green card process through the I-485 once your EB-5 petition is approved.
And just a small follow-up on this. So if the H-1B comes in before the EB-5 526 approval, then can you kind of opt out of this process, of the EB-5 process, or?
You can always withdraw an EB-5 petition. You can always withdraw an I-526 petition. You have to look at the offering documents, the private placement memorandum, to determine whether you have any right to get your money back or not. Very often you don't.
Okay.
But there's nothing that ever prevents you from withdrawing the EB-5 petition. It's pretty rare, though, that we have an H-1B client who said, oh, now that I'm an H-1B, I'm going to withdraw my EB-5, because the H-1B, for all the reasons we've been talking about for the last hour or two, is not the most certain way of advancing your career and your life in the U.S.
Okay.
And it also takes around 12 to 16 years to get your green card on EB2 or EB3.
So that was my second question. Is it advisable? Probably not. You know, if you get an H-1B, you
that's the only thing I can give a one-word answer to. No.
All right. Thank you so much.
Welcome. There's a gentleman at the mic, so if you could just,
I know you mentioned that there are different stages, right? We start from 526, goes to 485, and then finally the last one, right? And each stage has their own, its own rejection or approval rates, right? So in your experience so far, how many people in terms of percentage actually end up filing 829 and get their green cards in terms of overall approval rate?
Their overall market statistics. For our firm, we've never had a regional center EB-5 case denied at any stage. That's different on the direct side, and that's always been because of business failures.
Yeah, my question was more focused on regional center than direct.
Ron?
Yeah, again, it's very, very rare in our experience to see a denial. I don't know if we've ever had a source of funds denial. I have a lot of people on our team, so I'd have to check with everybody. I don't think we've had a source of funds denial. We've had projects challenged, and some we've gone to court and been successful. But with the regional center EB-5s, if there's going to be a problem, in most cases it's going to be because there's something about the structure of the project that the Immigration Service didn't like.
And I think, really, if you do proper due diligence, and not just someone who's fully informed, if you really do proper due diligence on the projects, you see the risks, and you really do. So if you engage someone that really knows what they're doing, I really think that your probability of having a project side problem doesn't go away, but it becomes really quite low.
Right. At CanAm, till date, we are 16 years old. In the EB-5 industry, we've had 4,000 plus green card approvals, conditional green card approvals, no denials from the project side. Out of those 4,000, 2,000 plus have reached the stage of removal of conditions. Again, no denials. And out of those, 1,700 plus investors have reached the stage of repayment of capital. Again, always paid in full and on time.
So Abby and I were in Delhi, about 4 or 5 years ago, and we had some people who wanted to invest in that JPEG project, and for reasons not to do with immigration, we advised them not to do it, basically, and it turned out to be correct advice.
Right.
I know a lot of people are waiting, but this question might help many of them. I did some research, but I found, to your point, there are tons of regional centers out there on USCIS website. You have been talking a lot about due diligence, but personally, I don't know where to start, right? I cannot go and look into every regional center. So what should be my best option to start with?
That's why you should not do it personally and hire an attorney.
I'll tell you how. Honestly, your question is a difficult one that we've grappled with. As an attorney, when you walk into my office, there are 3 things I could do. Number 1, I could say, I think you should invest in this project. I won't do that. It's not my decision where to invest. Part of the decision has to do with, is it a good investment, which I don't feel competent to discuss with you, or to answer for you. I wouldn't trust myself. I'd have my own advisor. So therefore, we don't say you should invest in this project. On the other extreme, I could say, here's a list of 800 regional centers and 4,000 projects. See me in 7 years once you've looked at all of them. For obvious reasons, we don't do that either. So we have come up with a compromise solution that has worked for us for a number of years, which is we keep track of projects that in some cases it may be a project that we know has what's called an exemplar approval from the Immigration Service. In other cases, it may be that other investors have invested in that project and we've done immigration due diligence and it passed our due diligence. That goes on the list. In addition to the projects, we list a small handful of regional centers, including certainly CanAm, that has had a wonderful track record, that has had 70 successful projects. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the 71st will be successful, but if I were a betting man, there's a pretty decent chance that that 71st may be successful. So we list what we believe are the top regional centers and projects that we've done immigration due diligence on, and we say, here, you don't have to invest in any project on the list, but if you want to at least hone it down to a group that we think you ought to look at, let's look at that. And at the first call or meeting with our client, we're going to go through that list and try to find out from our client, well, what are you really looking at? Ski resort in Vermont? No, that's not really what I'm looking at. There's no real reason that it has to be on the East Coast or the West Coast, but you may feel more comfortable that. You may feel more comfortable with a big hotel or hospital or educational facility or nursing home. We talk about all those things. My clients ask me a lot of questions about what I know about each project, and in the end, my clients will usually say, all right, well, let's look at 2 or 3 of these. And then you'll look at 2 or 3 and come back to me, and through that process, you'll eventually choose your project.
We have the same pretty similar process. A couple of sort of extra emphasis is if you look at it from the experience of having bluntly done a lot of real estate investment projects, one of the things you notice about EB5 is an EB5 investor does not get the same level of information as you would if you're an institutional investor. What does that mean? That means that whoever that regional center is, you have to have some amount of trust in them. So the regional centers that we have projects in, I've met them, we know them. I've known regional center, CanAm, for a number of years. As a firm, we interact with them very frequently. That's kind of a nice thing to do, but it's also a serious point because you need to know that these are, honest, reputable people that truly have the interests of the investors at heart. And to be very candid, that I don't think is true at every regional center. So everything that Ron just said is completely accurate and fair, but when you look at the rights that the lending documents bestow upon the regional center, they A, need to know what they're doing, and B, you need to be able to trust them to act in your interest. And an attorney having a decade-long relationship with people and really knowing how they think and how they feel, I think that's a really important fact.
And the biggest red flag for me personally is if a regional center is offering a package deal that via your regional center, this is your attorney and this is a package deal, that's a red flag. They're trying to control the environment because they don't want an attorney to point out the mistakes in their project. So any regional center will give you a panel of attorneys to choose from, and any attorney will give you a panel of regional centers to choose from. That's
what Ron said is true. You can have an excellent regional center with really good people, and they can just have a project that's, let's just say, it's not the best one in the market. And the attorney needs to feel free to explain to you why that is the case. We will give you the information on why we think that's the case, but we don't make the decision for you. You get to make the decision.
Very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is about let's suppose you verified that the fund is there, but do we need to invest right in the first day itself, or it will be eventually you will invest slowly in the course of?
Ron, he's asking if it needs to be invested in one go, or can you send your funds in tranches?
Right. Mark addressed this before, and I agree with what he said. If you read the immigration law, you don't have to invest 100% of the $500,000 when you file the I-526 petition. Virtually never will we do a case like that. Even though that's what the law says, more important than what the law says is how the Immigration Service thinks. And the Immigration Service is generally, in our experience, not real comfortable when somebody invests, let's say, $300,000 and has to show that they have the other $200,000 now, and it's not like they're going to get it eventually. They have to show they have it, that they're irrevocably prepared to invest it. There have been some cases approved with that. They generally have not been cases we file, so I would certainly say in 99% of the cases and 100% of the ones we do, the investor invests 100% up front because that's what the Immigration Service likes to see.
Okay. Yeah. So one more question actually. Let's suppose the project is for the 2 years, and the 2 years is the time for approval of a conditional green card.
Right.
So after that, again it's a 1 year or 2 year time for the without condition green card.
Right.
So during that period, how a person will prove that, okay, means the project was in sustainable mode, or means like you are not getting, or means what you are getting the profit or not?
So first thing is the 2-year time period that you're talking about is an average time period, and it can be as little as 6 months, and it can be up to 3 years to get your approval of conditional green card. Just depends. Second thing is, yes, once you get your conditional green card, then USCIS is looking at performance of your funds, that is whether they've been invested and the jobs have been created. In this case, this is where regional centers are really important, because it is our job to track the spending and look at the job creation. We do our diligence on how the money is being spent, whether it's being spent according to the business plan or not, because if it is not, then our economic model doesn't work and the jobs are not created. So you're solely dependent on the regional center there.
Okay, and when can one start to get the profit, means like taking out the profit from?
Most regional center investments are debt-based investments with a fixed return. You will probably get 0.25 or 0.5%. This is not, you're not making this to get money. This is just to get a green card. And usually it's paid annually.
Just one little thing, like if you suddenly have someone coming to you with a project with 6% interest rate, just think about why they're paying you 6% if they could get all their investors at quarter.
Yeah,
thank you everyone for the questions. At this point, I'd just like to bring up our last panel. But thank you, Abhi and Ron and Mark. Appreciate it.